When a respected black judge, Jeremiah Cole, visits a small-town courthouse, he becomes the target of blatant racism and abuse of power by a corrupt sheriff determined to protect his control. Arrested under false pretenses, Jeremiah faces public humiliation and systemic injustice, exposing the deeply entrenched racism in America. As the sheriff's racist tactics escalate, the judge's composure and determination are tested in a battle that shakes the entire town. This gripping story of corruption, prejudice, and resilience reveals the infuriating realities of systemic bias and the courage it takes to fight back. The clinking of cutlery and the hum of casual conversations filled the air at Rosie's Diner, a quaint little spot nestled on the corner of Maple Street. Layla Hart balanced a tray of steaming coffee cups, her practiced steps avoiding the bustling crowd. It was another busy Saturday morning, and Layla, with her warm smile and quick wit, had become a favorite among the regulars. "Table 7 needs a refill," called Sandra, her co-worker, from behind the counter. "On it," Layla replied, expertly weaving her way through the maze of chairs and customers. She loved this job, not because it was glamorous, but because it allowed her to connect with people. Despite the long hours and low pay, it felt fulfilling. She took pride in her work, making every patron feel welcome, regardless of who they were or where they came from. That's when she saw him. A man in a crisp gray suit, seated at the corner booth, snapping his fingers for her attention. His demeanor radiated entitlement, and the dismissive look he cast at the other diners sent a chill down her spine. "Excuse me," the man said as she approached, his voice dripping with impatience. "Do you think you could move any slower? I've been waiting for my coffee for 10 minutes. Layla took a deep breath, keeping her voice calm. "I'm sorry for the wait, sir. I'll get that for you right away." As she turned to fetch the coffee, he muttered under his breath, loud enough for her to hear, "Typical." She froze. The word hung in the air like a storm cloud, its weight sinking into her chest. Slowly, Layla turned back to him, her smile faltering. "Excuse me?" she asked, her voice steady but firm. "I said typical," the man repeated, leaning back in his seat with an arrogant smirk. "You people always have an excuse." The din of the diner seemed to fade, as Layla's world narrowed to that one table. Her hands trembled as she gripped the tray, a million thoughts racing through her mind. Every eye in the diner turned toward the unfolding confrontation. She could feel the weight of their stares, some curious, others filled with silent support. "Sir," she said, her voice trembling but unwavering. "We don't tolerate that kind of language here. If you continue, I'll have to ask you to leave." The man's smirk twisted into a sneer. "And who's going to make me you?" Layla stood her ground, her heart pounding in her chest. "Yes, me." The warm morning sun filtered through the towering oaks lining the courthouse square in Maplewood, a quaint southern town that looked as though it had been plucked from a bygone era. The white columns of the courthouse gleamed in the sunlight, their classic architecture a stark reminder of the weighty matters that transpired within. But for all its charm, the town's veneer of idyllic small-town life masked a deep undercurrent of resistance to change, a tension woven into its fabric over decades. Jeremiah Cole stepped out of his sleek black sedan, the car's understated design betraying little of the wealth and influence of its owner. His tailored gray suit, complemented by a crisp white shirt and deep blue tie, was sharp but not ostentatious. A leather satchel hung casually from his shoulder, and as he adjusted his glasses, he surveyed the courthouse steps with a faint smile. "Still looks the same," he muttered to himself, his voice carrying a hint of nostalgia. He had been here before, years ago, as a young law student, shadowing his mentor. Back then, he'd been wide-eyed and eager, unaware of the hurdles he'd face, not just in the courtroom, but in life. Now, decades later, Judge Jeremiah Cole was one of the most respected federal judges in the nation. His rulings had shaped policy, his speeches had inspired reform, and his calm, measured demeanor had made him a revered figure. Yet, Jeremiah wore his power lightly. He was a man who eschewed pomp and circumstance, choosing instead to focus on the substance of his work. He'd never forgotten his roots, a childhood spent in a modest neighborhood where community and resilience were the only currency that mattered. Today, he had come to Maplewood unannounced to observe proceedings in the courthouse and speak with the local judiciary about systemic reforms. He wanted to experience the town's legal workings firsthand, not as the prominent Judge Cole, but as just another man in the crowd. It was an approach he often took, quietly slipping into spaces to better understand the realities that data and reports couldn't capture. Jeremiah took the courthouse steps 2 at a time, his polished leather shoes clicking against the worn stone. He held the door open for an older couple leaving the building, their expressions weary but polite. "Thank you, young man," the woman said, offering him a kind smile. Jeremiah returned it. "You're welcome, ma'am." Inside, the air was cooler, carrying the faint scent of wood polish and old paper. The courthouse lobby was a blend of history and bureaucracy, with worn benches along the walls and a towering portrait of an austere judge from the early 1900s presiding over the room. A small line had formed at the security checkpoint, where a metal detector and a bored-looking officer were stationed. Jeremiah joined the line, adjusting the strap of his satchel. Ahead of him, a young woman in business attire fumbled with her briefcase, spilling its contents onto the floor. He bent down instinctively, helping her gather papers and notebooks. "Thank you," she said, her cheeks flushing. "I've got an important presentation today, and of course, this happens." "Always at the worst time," Jeremiah said with a chuckle, handing her the last of the scattered papers. "Good luck with your presentation." As he stepped forward in line, the security officer, a young white man with a buzz cut and a badge that read, "Officer Lawson," barely glanced up. "Empty your pockets and place your bag on the belt," he said, his tone clipped. Jeremiah complied, slipping his phone and keys into the tray and sliding his satchel onto the conveyor belt. When he stepped through the metal detector, the machine let out a sharp beep. Lawson's head snapped up, his eyes narrowing as he approached. "Step back and try again," the officer said, motioning with exaggerated impatience. Jeremiah did as instructed, only for the machine to beep again. "Anything else in your pockets?" Lawson asked, his tone carrying a hint of suspicion. "No, nothing," Jeremiah replied calmly, holding his arms out as the officer swept a wand over him. It beeped faintly near his wrist. "Watch," Jeremiah said, removing the sleek timepiece and placing it in the tray. Lawson gave him a once-over, his gaze lingering for a moment longer than necessary. "All right, go through," he muttered, waving Jeremiah along. Jeremiah collected his belongings and moved toward the directory posted near the elevators. Before he could step away, Lawson called out behind him, "Hey, where do you think you're going?" Jeremiah turned, surprised by the question. "Courtroom B," he replied. "You got a hearing or something?" Lawson asked, leaning against the counter with an air of authority. "Not exactly," Jeremiah said, keeping his tone neutral. "I'm here to observe." Lawson's eyes narrowed, his lips curling into a faint smirk. "Observe, huh? Let me guess. You're a reporter looking for some juicy small-town drama?" Jeremiah suppressed a sigh. He had seen this kind of attitude before, dismissive, tinged with an unspoken assumption that someone like him couldn't possibly belong here. "No," Jeremiah said evenly. "I'm here to meet Judge Weatherly." Lawson's smirk faded slightly. "Judge Weatherly doesn't meet with just anyone," he said, his tone sharpening. "You got credentials?" Jeremiah opened his satchel and pulled out a neatly folded letter of introduction. Before he could hand it over, Lawson snatched it from his grasp, his eyes scanning the letter with a faint sneer. "This real?" Lawson asked, holding the letter up as though expecting it to burst into flames. "Yes," Jeremiah replied, his patience wearing thin. "I believe it is." Lawson handed the letter back with exaggerated slowness, his smirk returning. "All right, go on, but don't wander where you're not supposed to." Jeremiah's jaw tightened, but he nodded and walked toward the elevators, leaving the exchange behind. He pressed the button for the second floor, his thoughts already shifting to the cases he hoped to observe. When the elevator doors opened, he stepped into a quieter hallway lined with wood-paneled walls and plaques commemorating past judges. The door to courtroom B stood ajar, and Jeremiah slipped inside, taking a seat in the back row. The room smelled faintly of pine, the polished benches reflecting the morning light streaming through tall windows. A case was already in progress. A landlord-tenant dispute over late rent payments. Judge Weatherly, a middle-aged white man with a stern expression, presided from the bench, his gravelly voice filling the room. Jeremiah listened intently, taking mental notes on the judge's handling of the proceedings. It wasn't long before whispers began to ripple through the room. Jeremiah glanced around and noticed a few people casting curious glances in his direction. He knew that look, the quiet recognition of someone who didn't quite belong in the usual crowd. When the session ended and the courtroom began to empty, Judge Weatherly spotted Jeremiah and motioned for him to approach. "Jeremiah Cole," Weatherly said, extending a hand as Jeremiah reached the bench. "I didn't expect to see you here today." "I wanted to observe," Jeremiah said with a polite smile, "and perhaps discuss a few ideas for improving community outreach." Weatherly nodded, his expression warming. "I'd be glad to talk, but let's step into my chambers." Less formal. As they exited the courtroom, Jeremiah caught sight of Officer Lawson standing in the hallway, his arms crossed and his gaze fixed on him. This time, the smirk was gone, replaced by something harder to read. Jeremiah held Lawson's gaze for a moment, then turned and followed Weatherly down the hall, ready to do what he had come here for. The judge's chambers were modest but dignified, with shelves of well-worn legal tomes and a scattering of personal photos on the desk. Judge Weatherly poured 2 cups of coffee from a carafe, handing one to Jeremiah. "I've been reading about some of your rulings," Weatherly began, his tone conversational but measured. "The Coleman Act, in particular. That decision must have stirred up quite the hornet's nest." Jeremiah offered a polite smile, taking a seat opposite the desk. It wasn't an easy ruling, but it was the right one. Equal access to housing is fundamental, a loophole that perpetuates discriminatory practices needed to be closed. Weatherly leaned back, his brow furrowing. "You'll find Maplewood isn't quite as progressive as your usual circles. Change comes slower here, and folks tend to bristle at anything that feels like an outside influence." Jeremiah took a sip of coffee, carefully gauging Weatherly's tone. It was a sentiment he'd encountered before, resistance cloaked in the guise of tradition. "Change is rarely comfortable," he said evenly, "but that doesn't make it any less necessary." Their conversation was interrupted by a knock at the door. Officer Lawson stepped inside without waiting for an invitation, his expression a mixture of impatience and something harder to pin down. "Judge Weatherly, there's been an incident in the lobby," Lawson said, his gaze briefly flicking to Jeremiah. "We could use your input." Weatherly sighed, setting his coffee down. "What kind of incident?" "A disagreement between a visitor and security could get messy if we don't address it quickly." Jeremiah rose from his seat, instinctively straightening his tie. "Perhaps I can help mediate." Lawson's eyes narrowed. "That won't be necessary." Weatherly waved him off. "Nonsense, Judge Cole is more than qualified to assist. Let's see what's going on." As they walked back to the lobby, the tension in Lawson's shoulders was palpable. Jeremiah kept pace with Weatherly, his expression calm, but his mind racing. The officer's demeanor had been off since their first interaction, and now, his clipped tone and sidelong glances hinted at something deeper. When they reached the lobby, the scene was chaotic. A young black man in a hoodie stood near the security checkpoint, his voice raised but controlled. A cluster of onlookers had formed, whispering among themselves as Lawson's colleagues tried to defuse the situation. "I told you, I'm here for the zoning meeting," the man said, holding up a folder. "I have every right to be here." "Why are you asking me so many questions?" "Sir," one of the officers said, his tone strained with condescension, "we're just doing our job. You didn't provide proper identification." "I showed you my ID twice," the man shot back, "but you let those 2 guys through without asking for anything." Jeremiah's eyes flicked to the 2 men in question, middle-aged white men in suits who stood off to the side, their heads down, avoiding the commotion. A pang of recognition hit him. This wasn't just about a lack of ID. This was profiling. Plain and simple. Weatherly frowned, stepping forward. "What's going on here?" One of the officers turned, clearly relieved to see the judge. "This gentleman refused to comply with security procedures, Your Honor. We were just trying to ensure everyone's safety." "That's not true," the young man interjected. "I followed the same process as everyone else, but I'm the only one being stopped." "Why is that?" Jeremiah stepped forward, his voice calm but firm. "What's your name?" The young man turned to him, his expression wary but appreciative of the question. Darius Hill." "Darius, let me see the ID you provided," Jeremiah said. Darius handed over his state-issued ID, along with the paperwork for the zoning meeting. Jeremiah reviewed it briefly before looking at the officers. Everything seems to be in order. Was there another issue? Lawson cleared his throat, stepping into the circle. It's standard procedure to question individuals who seem out of place. Jeremiah's eyes narrowed. Out of place in a public courthouse? Lawson bristled. I mean, wearing a hoodie and carrying a backpack doesn't exactly scream zoning board. We have to be cautious. Jeremiah held his gaze, his voice dropping into a lower, more deliberate tone. Are you suggesting this man's attire justifies treating him differently because I'm standing here in a suit, and you still question me at security? The onlookers grew quiet, their attention fully on the unfolding exchange. Lawson's jaw tightened, but he said nothing. I've worked in courthouses for over 2 decades, Jeremiah continued, his voice steady but pointed. And I can tell you that no matter how you dress it up, profiling is profiling. Darius Hill has every right to be here. Unless you have actual cause for concern, I suggest you let him proceed. Weatherly stepped forward, placing a hand on Lawson's shoulder. He's right. Let's not make this more complicated than it needs to be. Lawson hesitated, his face a mask of barely contained frustration. Finally, he stepped back, motioning for the other officers to disperse. Darius let out a breath, his shoulders relaxing. Thank you, he said, his voice quieter now. I appreciate it. Jeremiah nodded. You shouldn't have needed my help, but I'm glad I could be here. As Darius walked away, the tension in the room began to dissipate. The onlookers slowly returned to their business, though a few cast lingering glances at Lawson, who remained rooted in place, his expression unreadable. Weatherly sighed, turning to Jeremiah. I'm sorry you had to see that Lawson can be overzealous. Jeremiah's gaze didn't waver. Overzealous is a generous term. Behavior like that undermines trust in the very institution we're here to uphold. Weatherly nodded, his expression grim. I'll speak to him. This kind of incident can't become a pattern. Jeremiah didn't reply immediately. His mind was already spinning, the weight of what he'd witnessed settling heavily on his shoulders. This wasn't just about Lawson. It was about a system that allowed people like him to operate unchecked, shielded by authority and excuses. As he left the courthouse that afternoon, the crisp autumn air felt heavier. He had come to Maplewood to observe, to quietly understand the town's challenges, but now, he knew he couldn't stay silent. Jeremiah Cole returned to the courthouse the next morning, his demeanor composed, but his thoughts still troubled by the previous day's events. The incident with Darius Hill lingered in his mind, not just as an isolated moment, but as a symptom of something far deeper. He had planned this visit to Maplewood as a quiet observation, but now it was clear that silence wasn't an option. As he entered the lobby, the atmosphere felt heavier. Conversations hushed as people noticed him, some offering polite nods, others casting curious or wary glances. The courthouse staff seemed on edge, their usual routines marked by a subtle stiffness. Jeremiah could feel it. The ripple effect of yesterday's confrontation. The air was thick with unspoken tension, and he knew his presence was at the center of it. Judge Cole, a voice called out, breaking the quiet. It was Judge Weatherly, striding toward him with a forced smile. Good to see you again. I was hoping we could talk. Jeremiah nodded. Of course, lead the way. Weatherly ushered him into a small conference room, closing the door behind them. His expression shifted as soon as they were alone, the polite mask giving way to something more serious. I need to address what happened yesterday, Weatherly began, sitting across from Jeremiah. Officer Lawson has filed a report about your involvement in the incident with Mr. Hill. Jeremiah's brow furrowed. My involvement, I stepped in to de-escalate a situation that was mishandled from the start. Weatherly sighed, rubbing his temples. I understand that. And I agree Lawson was out of line. But he's claiming you undermined security protocol and interfered with official procedures. It's nonsense, of course, but the sheriff's office is taking it seriously. Jeremiah leaned back in his chair, his gaze steady. Let me guess. This is about more than Lawson. He's just the face of a larger problem. Weatherly hesitated before nodding. Maplewood has its challenges, Judge Cole. You've seen some of them firsthand, but there are people here, people in power, who don't take kindly to outsiders stirring the pot. I'm not here to stir the pot, Jeremiah said, his voice firm. I'm here to ensure the pot isn't boiling over while everyone pretends not to notice. Weatherly leaned forward, his voice dropping. I admire your resolve, but you're walking into a minefield. The sheriff's office has been under scrutiny for years, but nothing sticks. Corruption runs deep here, and they don't like anyone shining a light on it. Jeremiah met Weatherly's gaze, his expression unyielding. Then it's time someone did. Later that morning, Jeremiah attended a public meeting in the courthouse's largest conference room. The meeting, ostensibly about zoning regulations, was packed with local officials, residents, and a smattering of reporters. Jeremiah took a seat near the back, quietly observing as the discussion unfolded. Midway through the session, a man in a dark suit entered the room, his presence commanding immediate attention. Sheriff Randall Kirkland. His reputation preceded him, a man known for his iron grip on the town and a network of allies that ensured his authority went unchallenged. Jeremiah watched as Kirkland scanned the room, his eyes briefly settling on him. There was no acknowledgement, just a flicker of recognition before the sheriff took a seat near the front. The meeting continued, but Jeremiah could feel the weight of Kirkland's gaze from across the room. When the session ended, Jeremiah lingered in the hallway, waiting for the crowd to thin. He wasn't surprised when Kirkland approached him, his steps deliberate and his expression unreadable. Judge Cole, Kirkland said, extending a hand. Welcome to Maplewood. I've heard a lot about you. Jeremiah shook his hand, his grip firm. I'm sure you have. Kirkland's smile didn't reach his eyes. You've caused quite a stir in just a couple of days. Folks around here don't take kindly to disruptions. Disruption is often necessary to address injustice, Jeremiah replied evenly. Kirkland chuckled, a low, mirthless sound. Injustice, huh? That's a big word. Careful how you throw it around, people might get the wrong idea. Jeremiah held his gaze, refusing to be intimidated. I'm here to observe and offer guidance, Sheriff. If that's causing a stir, maybe it's worth examining why. Kirkland's smile faded. You're stepping into matters that don't concern you. Maplewood has its own way of doing things, and we don't need outsiders telling us how to run our town. Justice concerns everyone, Jeremiah said. And as far as I'm concerned, there's no such thing as outsiders when it comes to ensuring fairness and accountability. Kirkland's eyes darkened, and for a moment, the tension between them crackled like a live wire. Then, with a curt nod, the sheriff turned and walked away. That afternoon, Jeremiah visited a local diner for lunch. The place was quiet, with only a handful of patrons scattered across the booths. As he sipped his coffee and reviewed his notes, he noticed two deputies entering the diner. They moved purposefully toward him, their expressions stern. Judge Cole, one of them said, his voice loud enough to draw the attention of the other customers. We need you to come with us. Jeremiah set his coffee down, his expression calm. On what grounds? The deputy held up a piece of paper. We have a warrant for your arrest, obstruction of justice. The room fell silent. Jeremiah could feel every eye on him as he stood, his movements deliberate and composed. I see the warrant? The deputy handed it over, and Jeremiah quickly scanned the document. It was vague, filled with legal jargon meant to obscure its lack of substance. This wasn't about justice, it was about sending a message. I'll cooperate, Jeremiah said, handing the warrant back. But let me be clear, this won't end the way you think it will. The deputies led him out of the diner, the sound of murmured whispers following them. As he was escorted into the back of a patrol car, Jeremiah felt a flicker of anger rise in his chest, but he pushed it down, replacing it with a quiet resolve. The holding cell was small and cold, its concrete walls pressing in around him. Jeremiah sat on the bench, his hands folded in his lap as he waited. He had no doubt this was a calculated move, designed to humiliate him and undermine his credibility. But he also knew it was a mistake. The sound of footsteps echoed down the hallway, and a moment later, the cell door opened. Sheriff Kirkland stepped inside, his expression smug. Comfortable? Kirkland asked, leaning against the wall. Jeremiah met his gaze, unflinching. As comfortable as one can be under the circumstances. Kirkland chuckled. You made a lot of noise in that courtroom yesterday. Thought you'd learn to stay in your lane. I'm exactly where I need to be, Jeremiah replied. And so are you, standing on the wrong side of history. Kirkland's smile faded, his jaw tightening. You think you're some kind of hero? You think anyone's going to care about your little crusade? I don't need to be a hero, Jeremiah said. I just need to shine a light. People like you thrive in the shadows, but the truth has a way of finding its way out. Kirkland stepped closer, his voice dropping to a dangerous whisper. You have no idea what you're dealing with. Walk away while you still can. Jeremiah held his ground, his voice steady. I've faced bigger threats than you, Sheriff, and I've never walked away. The door opened again, and Judge Weatherly entered, his expression tense. Sheriff, that's enough. Kirkland turned, his face a mask of frustration. This doesn't concern you, Weatherly. It does when you overstep, Weatherly said firmly. Judge Cole is being released, effective immediately. Kirkland glared at Weatherly, then at Jeremiah, before storming out of the room. As the door slammed shut behind him, Weatherly turned to Jeremiah. I pulled some strings to get you out, Weatherly said. But this isn't over. Kirkland won't let this go. Jeremiah nodded, his jaw set. Neither will I. The courthouse steps were packed with reporters by the time Jeremiah Cole was released, their cameras flashing like fireflies against the overcast sky. The sheriff's stunt had turned what might have been a quiet power play into a public spectacle. Jeremiah paused at the top of the steps, his calm demeanor masking the storm of emotions beneath. Judge Cole, one reporter shouted, elbowing his way to the front. Do you believe this arrest was politically motivated? Jeremiah adjusted his tie, his voice steady. I believe the law is clear, and the actions taken today were not in accordance with it. I have no further comment at this time. As he descended the steps, the crowd parted, their murmurs buzzing with speculation. Waiting at the bottom was Martin Hayes, a local attorney Jeremiah had met years ago, at a legal conference. Martin's face was taut with concern. They're trying to bury you, Martin said, falling into step beside him. This isn't just about Lawson or Kirkland, it's bigger. Jeremiah nodded. I know, but they've underestimated me. Martin hesitated. You're going to fight this, aren't you? Jeremiah stopped, his gaze sweeping over the gathered crowd. I didn't come to Maplewood to start a fight, Martin, but I won't back down from one either. Back in his hotel room, Jeremiah sat at the small desk, his laptop open as he combed through public records and court filings. The arrest warrant had been hastily issued, likely to intimidate him, but it also left breadcrumbs. He suspected there was more to this than Kirkland's bruised ego. His phone buzzed, and he answered without looking at the screen. Jeremiah Cole. It's Darius Hill, a familiar voice said. I heard what happened. Are you okay? Jeremiah leaned back in his chair, a faint smile crossing his lips. I'm fine, Darius. But it seems I've drawn more attention than I anticipated. Yeah, well, you're not the first. Kirkland and his people have been pulling stunts like this for years. They think they're untouchable. Everyone has a weak point, Jeremiah said thoughtfully. Sometimes it's just a matter of finding it. There was a pause on the line before Darius spoke again. There's something you should know. I work with a group, activists, lawyers, and community leaders. We've been gathering evidence on Kirkland for months. Corruption, misuse of funds, intimidation tactics. We've got a lot, but we need someone who knows how to make it stick. Jeremiah's pulse quickened. Send me what you have, I'll take a look. The next morning, Jeremiah met with Darius and two other members of the activist group, a no-nonsense woman named Renee and a tech-savvy college student named Malik. They had rented a small office space on the outskirts of town, its walls covered with maps, timelines, and photographs. Renee gestured to a corkboard filled with connected documents. We've been tracking Kirkland's activities for over a year, misappropriated public funds, land deals with no transparency, and a pattern of targeting anyone who threatens his power. Malik pulled up a series of spreadsheets on his laptop. We've got financial records showing money funneled through shell companies. It's messy, but it's there. Jeremiah studied the evidence, his mind racing. This is substantial. If presented correctly, it could lead to federal investigations. Renee crossed her arms, her expression skeptical. We've tried going to the authorities before. No one will touch it. Kirkland's got too many people in his pocket. That's where I come in, Jeremiah said. I still have connections in the Justice Department. If we can package this in a way that's airtight, they'll have to act. Darius looked at him, hope flickering in his eyes. You really think we can take him down? Jeremiah met his gaze, his voice resolute. I don't just think it, I know it. That afternoon, Jeremiah returned to the courthouse, armed with a renewed sense of purpose. As he walked through the lobby, he noticed Officer Lawson standing by the security checkpoint, his arms crossed. Their eyes met, and Lawson smirked. Back for round 2, Judge? Lawson called out, his tone mocking. Jeremiah didn't break stride, his voice calm but firm. Doing my job, Officer Lawson. Perhaps you should focus on yours. The smirk faded, replaced by a flicker of irritation. Jeremiah continued down the hallway, refusing to be baited. He had bigger battles to fight. Inside courtroom B, Judge Weatherly was presiding over a case, his expression tight with concentration. When the session ended, Weatherly motioned for Jeremiah to join him in chambers. I heard about the activist group, Weatherly said, his tone cautious. You're walking a fine line, Jeremiah. If you push too hard, Kirkland will come after you with everything he's got. He already has, Jeremiah replied. The only way to stop people like Kirkland is to shine a light on what they're doing. Weatherly sighed, leaning back in his chair. You're braver than most, or more stubborn? Probably both, Jeremiah said with a faint smile. But I need your help. If we're going to expose Kirkland, we need allies in the judiciary. Weatherly hesitated, his gaze flickering to the window. You're asking me to stick my neck out. I'm asking you to do what's right, Jeremiah said. This isn't just about me or Darius or even Maplewood, it's about ensuring the law applies to everyone, no matter how powerful they think they are. For a long moment, Weatherly was silent. Then he nodded. I'll make some calls. As the sun dipped below the horizon, casting long shadows across the town, Jeremiah and his newfound allies worked late into the night. The office buzzed with quiet determination as they compiled documents, cross-referenced timelines, and prepared a dossier that would be impossible to ignore. This is it, Renee said, placing the final report on the table. Everything we've got. Jeremiah picked it up, his expression unreadable. It's a start, but we're going to need one more thing to push this over the edge. What's that? Malik asked. Public accountability, Jeremiah said. A town hall meeting. We present the evidence, make it clear what's been happening, and force them to respond. Darius's eyes widened. That's risky. Kirkland's people could shut it down before we even start. That's why we have to make it big, Jeremiah said. Invite the press, local and national. The more eyes on this, the harder it'll be for them to silence us. By the time the meeting was announced, word had spread like wildfire. The town's main hall was packed, the air crackling with anticipation. Jeremiah stood backstage, the dossier clutched in his hands. He could hear the crowd murmuring, their voices a mix of curiosity and tension. This is it, Renee said, her voice low. No turning back now. Jeremiah nodded, his jaw set. Let's shine that light. As he stepped onto the stage, the room fell silent, all eyes on him. Jeremiah took a deep breath, his gaze sweeping over the crowd. He could see Kirkland in the front row, his expression stony, flanked by a group of his deputies. This was the moment everything had been building toward. Jeremiah opened the dossier, his voice steady as he began. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for being here tonight. What you are about to hear is the truth, a truth that has been hidden for far too long. The crowd in the town hall was restless, a hum of conversation filling the space as Jeremiah Cole stood on the stage, the dossier open in his hands. Sheriff Kirkland leaned back in his front row seat, arms crossed, his deputies flanking him like silent sentinels. The tension was palpable, the room charged with anticipation for what was about to unfold. Jeremiah scanned the faces before him, residents, reporters, and community leaders, before his gaze returned to Kirkland. Tonight, we're here to talk about accountability, he began, his voice steady and commanding. For too long, this town has operated under a shadow, a system where those in power believe they are untouchable, but tonight, we shine a light. He stepped forward, holding up the dossier. This report contains evidence of corruption, misuse of public funds, and abuse of power within the sheriff's office. It shows how public trust has been betrayed for personal gain, and it names those responsible. Kirkland's face remained impassive, but Jeremiah saw the slight twitch in his jaw, a crack in the armor. The sheriff leaned forward, his voice loud and cutting through the murmurs. "You've got a lot of nerve, Judge Cole. Coming here with your accusations, I'd like to see this so-called evidence." Jeremiah met his gaze, unflinching. "You'll get your chance, but first, let's talk about the people who've been affected by your actions." He gestured to Darius, who stood at the edge of the stage. The young man hesitated before stepping forward, his voice trembling slightly as he addressed the crowd. "I've lived in this town my whole life," Darius began. "And I've seen what happens to people who stand up to Kirkland. They lose their jobs, their homes. Sometimes worse, he uses fear to keep us in line." A murmur rippled through the audience. Kirkland's deputies shifted uneasily, their eyes darting between their boss and the growing discontent in the room. "This is slander," Kirkland barked, standing abruptly. "You're letting these outsiders poison your minds with lies." Jeremiah held up a hand, his voice calm but firm. "This isn't slander, Sheriff. This is the truth. And if you'd like to dispute it, let's start with these documents." He handed a copy of the dossier to a reporter in the front row, ensuring it would be seen by the press. Kirkland's face darkened as Jeremiah continued. Bank records showing funds diverted from community projects into private accounts, emails detailing backroom deals for land acquisitions, and testimonies from individuals who faced intimidation and harassment under your orders. The room erupted in gasps and murmurs. Kirkland's deputies exchanged uneasy glances, the cracks in their solidarity beginning to show. "You're making a mistake, Cole," Kirkland growled, stepping toward the stage. "You don't know who you're dealing with." Jeremiah didn't back down. "I know exactly who I'm dealing with, a man who's abused his power for years and thinks he's above the law. But let me remind you, Sheriff, no one is above the law." The crowd's murmurs grew louder, some voices shouting their support for Jeremiah. Kirkland's face twisted in anger, and he turned to his deputies. "Shut this down now." The deputies hesitated, the weight of the room pressing down on them. One of them, a younger man named Mitchell, stepped forward. "Sheriff, maybe we should—" "Do it!" Kirkland roared, his voice echoing through the hall. Before the deputies could act, Renee and Malik emerged from the crowd, holding up their phones. "Everything's being recorded," Renee shouted. "You can't stop this." The tension reached a boiling point as Kirkland turned back to Jeremiah, his fists clenched. "You think this changes anything? You're nothing but an outsider trying to tear this town apart." Jeremiah took a step closer, his voice low but resolute. "I'm not here to tear this town apart, I'm here to help it heal. And that starts by holding people like you accountable." For a moment, the two men stood face to face, the air between them charged with unspoken defiance. Then, from the back of the room, a voice called out. "Sheriff Kirkland, is it true you diverted money from the youth center project?" The question hung in the air like a guillotine. Kirkland turned, his eyes narrowing as he scanned the crowd. "Who said that?" More voices joined in, each one demanding answers. "What about the land deal on Main Street? Why did the community park funding disappear?" Kirkland's bluster faltered, his usual confidence crumbling under the weight of public scrutiny. Jeremiah seized the moment. "You've ruled this town with fear, Sheriff. But fear only works when people stay silent tonight. They're speaking out." The crowd erupted into cheers and shouts, the room transformed into a wave of collective empowerment. Kirkland's deputies, seeing the tide turn, stepped back, leaving their leader isolated. As the noise reached a crescendo, Kirkland turned to Jeremiah, his face a mask of fury. "You think you've won? This isn't over." Jeremiah met his gaze, his voice calm, but unyielding. "You're right. It's just beginning." The meeting ended with the crowd spilling into the streets, their voices echoing through the night. Reporters swarmed Jeremiah, their cameras capturing every angle of the story. But as he answered their questions, his focus remained on the task ahead. The dossier was only the beginning. Now the evidence needed to reach the right hands, those with the power to dismantle Kirkland's corrupt network. As Jeremiah returned to his hotel, a sense of resolve settled over him. The fight wasn't over, but the first blow had been struck. And for the first time, He saw hope in the eyes of Maplewood's residents, a spark of belief that change was possible. But as he unlocked the door to his room, his phone buzzed with a new message. It was from Renee. "Be careful. We've been getting threats. Kirkland won't go down without a fight." Jeremiah stared at the screen, the weight of the warning sinking in. He knew she was right. Kirkland wouldn't surrender quietly. The sheriff had resources, connections, and a deep-seated determination to hold on to his power. As Jeremiah closed the door behind him, he felt the gravity of the moment pressing down. The battle for justice was far from over, and the stakes were higher than ever. The courthouse was quiet that morning. The stillness broken only by the occasional squeak of shoes on the polished floors. Jeremiah Cole walked purposefully down the hallway, a folder clutched in his hand. Today would be the reckoning. A public hearing where the town would see Sheriff Kirkland face the evidence laid bare. The night before had been tense, with anonymous threats delivered to the activist group's phones, and the pressure mounting on everyone involved. Jeremiah had anticipated as much. Corruption never died quietly. Still, he felt the weight of responsibility, not just for himself, but for the residents who had placed their faith in him. As he entered the hearing room, he noted the packed audience, reporters, town officials, and ordinary citizens eager to see justice unfold. At the front of the room sat Sheriff Kirkland, flanked by his deputies. His demeanor was composed, but his eyes burned with suppressed rage as he spotted Jeremiah. "Good morning, Sheriff," Jeremiah said evenly as he approached the bench, his calm demeanor masking the fire burning within. "Judge Cole," Kirkland replied, his tone dripping with sarcasm, "I hope you've come to your senses and are ready to retract your baseless accusations." Jeremiah smiled faintly. "I think you'll find the accusations are far from baseless." The proceedings began, with Jeremiah presenting the compiled evidence to the town council and legal representatives. Each piece of documentation, a land deal orchestrated to benefit Kirkland's associates, funds funneled into private accounts, and witness testimonies of intimidation, was meticulously laid out. The crowd murmured, as each revelation painted an increasingly damning picture of the sheriff's corruption. Kirkland's defense attorney tried to interrupt, but Jeremiah's commanding presence kept the room in his grasp. "This isn't just about finances or abuse of power," Jeremiah said, addressing the audience directly. "It's about trust. Trust that has been eroded by those sworn to protect it. Sheriff Kirkland has used fear and manipulation to maintain control. It's time to end that cycle." Kirkland stood suddenly, slamming his hand on the table. "Enough of this," he barked. "You think you can waltz into my town, smear my name and walk away? You don't know a damn thing about how things work here." Jeremiah turned to face him, his expression calm but resolute. "I know that no one is above the law, Sheriff. Not even you." The room fell silent, the tension thick as the two men stared each other down. Kirkland's mask of composure slipped, revealing the raw anger beneath. "You're nothing but an outsider trying to tear this town apart." "I'm trying to rebuild it," Jeremiah replied, "because this town deserves better than fear and corruption." Kirkland's laughter was harsh and bitter. "You think you're some kind of hero? These people don't care about your high ideals, they just want things to stay the way they are." At that moment, one of Kirkland's own deputies stood up, his face pale, but determined. It was Mitchell, the younger officer who had shown hesitation before. "That's not true," Mitchell said, his voice shaking but firm. "We've known what's been happening, but we were too afraid to speak out. Judge Cole is right. This has to end." The room erupted in gasps and murmurs. Kirkland turned on Mitchell, his face contorted with fury. "You traitor!" Mitchell stood his ground. "It's over, Sheriff. You can't intimidate everyone forever." Jeremiah seized the moment, stepping forward. "This is what justice looks like, Sheriff. People standing up for what's right, even when it's hard." Kirkland's hand moved to his belt, where his badge gleamed alongside his holstered gun. The room tensed as his fingers brushed the weapon, his eyes locked on Jeremiah. For a moment, it seemed like the sheriff might lash out, but the weight of the room pressed down on him. "Don't," Jeremiah said, his voice steady but sharp. "Violence won't save you. It will only seal your fate." The silence stretched, heavy and charged, before Kirkland slowly stepped back, his hand dropping to his side. He looked around the room, his once loyal deputies avoiding his gaze, the townspeople whispering among themselves, and the reporters capturing every moment. "You'll regret this," Kirkland spat, his voice low and venomous. "All of you." The council chairperson spoke up, breaking the spell. "Sheriff Kirkland, you are hereby suspended pending an independent investigation. Your badge and weapon, please." Kirkland's face twisted in defiance, but he had no choice. He removed his badge and gun, slamming them onto the table before storming out of the room. The crowd erupted into a mix of cheers and shouts, the atmosphere electric with the promise of change. Outside the courthouse, Jeremiah stood with Darius, Renee, and Malik, the weight of the confrontation settling over them. The sky was gray, a storm brewing on the horizon, but the air felt lighter somehow. "You did it," Darius said, his voice filled with awe. "You actually did it." Jeremiah shook his head. "We did it, this isn't over, but it's a start." Renee crossed her arms, her expression guarded. "Kirkland won't go down without a fight, he's got connections. Statewide, maybe even higher." Jeremiah nodded. "I know, but now the spotlight is on him. That's a fight we're ready for." As they spoke, a black SUV pulled up to the curb. Two men in suits stepped out, their expressions serious. One of them approached Jeremiah, holding out a badge. "Judge Cole, we're with the FBI. We've been monitoring Sheriff Kirkland for some time. Your evidence has been invaluable." Jeremiah exchanged a glance with his team, a sense of relief washing over him. "Then you're here to take this further?" The agent nodded. "This is the beginning of a federal investigation. We'll be in touch, but for now, I suggest you stay cautious. Kirkland isn't the type to go quietly." Jeremiah watched as the agents entered the courthouse, their presence a stark reminder of the larger forces at play. The battle was far from over, but the tide had turned. Later that evening, Jeremiah sat alone in his hotel room, the adrenaline finally ebbing away. He stared out the window at the town below, its streets quiet and still. For the first time in days, he allowed himself a moment of reflection. He thought about the people he'd met, their courage, their resilience, their willingness to fight for a better future. He thought about Kirkland's parting words and the storm still to come. And he thought about the path ahead, uncertain, but filled with possibility. Jeremiah's phone buzzed, a message from Mitchell. "Thank you for giving us the courage to speak up. We'll stand with you." He smiled faintly, the words a reminder that even in the darkest moments, there was strength in unity. As the storm clouds gathered on the horizon, Jeremiah felt a sense of resolve. The fight for justice was never easy, but it was always worth it. The storm rolled in that night, rain pounding against the courthouse steps, as the news of Sheriff Kirkland's suspension spread like wildfire. By morning, the town was alive with speculation, the air buzzing with the possibility of change. The once untouchable sheriff was now the focus of both state and federal investigations, his grip on Maplewood slipping. For Jeremiah Cole, the victory was bittersweet. Sitting in the small office rented by the activist group, he reviewed the latest reports from the FBI agents who had taken over the case. Their work would take months, if not years, to fully unravel the network of corruption Kirkland had built. But for now, the town had seen a glimpse of justice, and that was a powerful thing. Renee entered the room, a coffee cup in each hand. She set one down in front of Jeremiah, her expression a mix of exhaustion and satisfaction. "You should see the paper," she said, sliding a copy of the Maplewood Gazette across the table. The headline read, "Sheriff Kirkland faces federal investigation. A town's reckoning begins." Jeremiah traced the bold letters with his fingers, his thoughts drifting. "It's a start," he said softly. "But the work isn't over." "It never is," Renee replied, taking a seat across from him. "But you gave this town something it hasn't had in a long time. Hope." Later that day, Jeremiah attended a community meeting in the same town hall where the confrontation had taken place. This time, the atmosphere was different. People spoke openly about their experiences with Kirkland's regime, their voices filled with both anger and relief. It was clear that the sheriff's fall had broken something loose, a flood of stories and emotions that had been bottled up for years. Darius stood at the front of the room, addressing the crowd with a confidence that hadn't been there before. "We can't stop here," he said, his voice steady. "This is our chance to rebuild Maplewood into a town where everyone feels safe, where power is held accountable." The audience erupted into applause, their energy infectious. Jeremiah watched from the back of the room, a quiet smile on his face. He had come to Maplewood as an observer, but he had become part of something bigger. A movement toward justice and transparency. As the meeting wrapped up, Darius approached Jeremiah, his face glowing with determination. "We're organizing a task force to oversee police reforms," he said. "We could use your guidance." Jeremiah considered the offer, the weight of it settling on his shoulders. "I'll help in any way I can," he said. "But the real work will come from this community. You're ready for it." Darius nodded, his expression resolute. "Thanks to you, we are." Meanwhile, Sheriff Kirkland's world was unraveling. News outlets had picked up the story, turning him into a symbol of small-town corruption. His remaining allies were scrambling to distance themselves, and his once loyal deputies were cooperating with investigators. Kirkland himself had retreated to his sprawling estate, his silence a stark contrast to his former bluster. But Jeremiah knew the fight wasn't over. The wheels of justice turned slowly, and men like Kirkland didn't go down without a final act of defiance. Still, the groundwork had been laid, and the system was beginning to correct itself. In the weeks that followed, Maplewood began to change. The interim sheriff, a woman named Angela Torres, quickly set about rebuilding trust within the community. She held public forums, implemented new training protocols for officers, and established an anonymous tip line for residents to report misconduct. Her leadership was a breath of fresh air, a stark contrast to Kirkland's reign. Jeremiah continued to work with Darius and the activist group, offering legal advice and helping to draft proposals for systemic reforms. His role in the town's transformation became a point of pride, but it also served as a reminder of the larger battles still to be fought. One evening, as he packed his belongings in the hotel room that had become his temporary home, Jeremiah received a call from Martin Hayes. "The State Bar wants you to speak at their next conference," Martin said. "Your work in Maplewood has caught their attention." Jeremiah chuckled softly. "I'm not sure I'm ready to be anyone's role model." "Too late for that," Martin replied. "You've proven that integrity still matters, even when it's inconvenient." The night before he was set to leave Maplewood, Jeremiah attended a small gathering organized by the activist group. They had rented out a local cafe, filling it with laughter, music, and a sense of triumph. As the evening wore on, Darius stood to make a toast. "To Judge Cole," he said, raising his glass. "You didn't just stand with us. You inspired us to stand for ourselves. Thank you for believing in this town, even when we didn't." The crowd erupted into cheers, their voices carrying a warmth that filled the room. Jeremiah raised his glass in return, his heart full. "To Maplewood," he said. "May this be the start of something greater." As Jeremiah drove out of town the next morning, the sun rose over Maplewood, casting a golden light on the familiar streets. He passed the courthouse, the diner, and the town hall, each place now holding memories of the battles fought and won. The road ahead was long and uncertain, but Jeremiah felt a renewed sense of purpose. In his rearview mirror, Maplewood grew smaller, but its impact stayed with him. It wasn't just a town, it was a testament to the power of resilience and the possibility of change. Jeremiah's phone buzzed with a new message. It was from Darius. "Thank you for everything, you're always welcome here." Smiling, Jeremiah placed the phone down and focused on the road ahead. He didn't know where his journey would take him next, but he knew one thing for certain. The fight for justice never ended, and he was ready to face whatever came next. Jeremiah Cole drove through the winding country roads, the sunlight filtering through the trees and casting golden patterns across the pavement. The quiet hum of the engine was a welcome reprieve from the chaos of the past weeks, giving him space to reflect on everything that had transpired in Maplewood. He had arrived in the small town as an observer, intending to stay on the periphery. But life had a way of pulling even the most cautious participants into the center of the storm. When he first walked into the courthouse and encountered the simmering tensions, Jeremiah knew the path ahead wouldn't be easy. What he didn't realize was how deeply rooted the issues were, or how much the town had been waiting for someone to challenge the status quo. Kirkland's corruption, intimidation, and abuse of power were the manifestations of a system built to silence dissent. But Maplewood's residents, weary yet resilient, proved that change could emerge from even the darkest circumstances when people stood together. Jeremiah thought of Darius Hill, whose quiet determination had transformed into confident leadership. He thought of Renee and Malik, whose tireless work behind the scenes had made the confrontation possible. And he thought of Mitchell, the deputy who had risked everything to speak out against his own boss. These were the true heroes of Maplewood, the ones who had taken the first step toward reclaiming their town. For Jeremiah, the journey was deeply personal. Standing up to Kirkland had forced him to revisit his own principles and the reasons he had become a judge in the first place. He had always believed in justice, but Maplewood reminded him that justice wasn't just a concept, it was an active, relentless pursuit. It required courage, sacrifice, and the willingness to confront uncomfortable truths, even when doing so came at a cost. Throughout the ordeal, Jeremiah had been tested in ways he hadn't anticipated. There were moments of doubt when the enormity of the task felt overwhelming, when it seemed like Kirkland's web of power would choke out any attempt at accountability. But he had learned to draw strength from the people around him, their courage, their stories, and their hope for a better future. In the face of adversity, Jeremiah found not just resolve, but a renewed sense of purpose. As he left Maplewood behind, Jeremiah knew his work there wasn't finished. The investigations into Kirkland's corruption would take time, and systemic reform didn't happen overnight. But the foundation had been laid, and the town was in capable hands. He carried with him the lessons of Maplewood, a reminder that even the smallest voices could challenge the loudest oppressors, and that standing up for what was right was always worth the fight. The broader implications of the events in Maplewood weighed heavily on Jeremiah's mind. The systemic issues that plagued the town were not unique to it. They were reflections of a much larger problem. Across the country, similar stories played out in different forms: communities silenced by corruption, marginalized groups targeted by those in power, and justice delayed by bureaucracy and fear. But if Maplewood proved anything, it was that change was possible. The courage of individuals like Darius and Mitchell was a testament to the power of collective action. Their willingness to risk everything to expose the truth sent ripples far beyond the town's borders. Already, other communities were reaching out to learn from Maplewood's experience, eager to dismantle their own cycles of corruption and fear. Jeremiah couldn't help but think of the people who had come before him: civil rights leaders, activists, and ordinary citizens who had fought for justice against impossible odds. Their legacies were the foundation upon which Maplewood's progress was built. And while the fight for equity and accountability was far from over, Jeremiah was inspired by the knowledge that every step forward, no matter how small, mattered. The events in Maplewood also highlighted the importance of vigilance. Kirkland's reign of corruption hadn't sprung up overnight. It had taken years of small compromises, unchecked power, and a culture of silence to grow. Jeremiah's arrest, though an act of intimidation, was also a desperate attempt to protect a crumbling system. It underscored the urgency of holding leaders accountable and ensuring that power remained a responsibility, not a weapon. As Jeremiah thought about the next steps in his own journey, he felt a renewed commitment to his role as a judge. His time in Maplewood had shown him the impact of using his position not just to interpret the law, but to actively uphold its principles. It wasn't enough to sit in a courtroom and render decisions. Justice required engagement with the communities he served, an understanding of their struggles, and a willingness to challenge the status quo. Jeremiah also realized the importance of storytelling. The power of Darius's testimony, the courage of Mitchell's confession, and the resilience of Maplewood's residents had turned a local scandal into a national conversation. Their voices were proof that stories could inspire action, bridge divides, and bring light to even the darkest corners. Jeremiah resolved to carry their stories with him, sharing them with others, as a reminder of what was possible when people came together. On the final stretch of his drive, Jeremiah stopped at a roadside cafe, the hum of conversations and the smell of fresh coffee filling the air. As he sat at a corner table, he pulled out a notebook and began to write, capturing his thoughts while they were still fresh. The words flowed easily, a reflection of everything he had experienced and learned. He wrote about resilience, the quiet strength of a community refusing to be silenced. He wrote about courage, the bravery it took to stand up to power, even when the odds seemed insurmountable. And he wrote about hope, the belief that change was always possible, even in the face of adversity. As he closed the notebook, Jeremiah felt a sense of closure. The events in Maplewood had changed him, sharpening his resolve and deepening his understanding of justice. But more than that, they had reminded him of the humanity at the heart of his work. Behind every case, every ruling, and every law were people, flawed, hopeful, and deserving of dignity. When Jeremiah finally reached his destination, a small courthouse in a neighboring county, he stepped out of his car and took a deep breath. The air was crisp, the promise of a new day lingering on the horizon. He didn't know what challenges lay ahead, but he knew he was ready to face them. As he walked up the courthouse steps, his phone buzzed with a new message. It was from Renee. "Kirkland's federal indictment is official. The fight continues, but we're making progress. Thanks for believing in us." Jeremiah smiled, slipping the phone back into his pocket. The fight for justice never ended, but that was the beauty of it. Each victory, no matter how small, was a step forward. A beacon of hope in a world that desperately needed it. With a renewed sense of purpose, Jeremiah entered the courthouse, ready to continue the work that had defined his life. The story of Maplewood was far from over, but its legacy was clear. Justice was possible, and the power to achieve it lay in the hands of those brave enough to demand it.